On the night of November 8, 2016, Michael Durant pulled into the gravel parking area at the Blackwater Creek trailhead just after 9:30 in the evening. The air was cold, hovering around 38 degrees, and a light mist hung in the darkness between the towering Douglas firs and western hemlocks that surrounded the trail system. Michael was 34 years old, fit and experienced, with 9 years of service as a park ranger at Cascade Ridge State Park in rural Washington. The park covered 12,000 acres of dense forest, steep ridges, and winding creek systems that fed into the Cascade River. It was beautiful country during the day, but at night it became something else, isolated, disorienting, and unforgiving to anyone who didn't know their way. Michael knew his way. He'd patrolled these trails hundreds of times, in every season and every condition. He knew where the terrain turned treacherous, where black bears denned in the winter, where illegal campers liked to set up in the summer months, and where poachers sometimes laid traps despite the steep fines and criminal charges they'd face if caught. Michael took his job seriously. He believed in protecting the land and the wildlife, and he had a reputation among his colleagues as someone who was thorough, calm under pressure, and reliable. He was the ranger you wanted on duty when something went wrong, because he didn't panic and he always finished what he started. That evening, Michael was responding to reports that had come in over the previous few days. Hikers had mentioned seeing signs of illegal camping near the northern trail system, fire pits that hadn't been there before, trash left behind, and trampled vegetation, suggesting someone had been staying in areas that were supposed to be off-limits. There had also been a troubling report from a local hunter who'd found what looked like illegal animal traps near Blackwater Creek. Poaching was a persistent problem in the area, with some individuals targeting deer and elk out of season, or worse, setting traps for protected species. Michael's assignment that night was to investigate, document any evidence, and if possible, locate whoever was responsible. At 9:47 p.m., Michael radioed dispatch from his patrol vehicle. His voice came through clear and professional, confirming his location at the Blackwater Creek trailhead and stating his intention to hike the northern trail system to check for signs of illegal activity. The dispatcher acknowledged, logged the time and location, and told Michael to check in every 30 minutes as per protocol for solo night patrols. Michael confirmed and signed off. He gathered his gear, a heavy-duty flashlight, his sidearm holstered at his hip, a backpack containing water, a first aid kit, evidence bags, a camera, and his handheld GPS unit. He locked his vehicle, turned on his flashlight, and headed into the darkness. The trail from the parking area followed Blackwater Creek for about a quarter mile before splitting into two paths, one that continued along the creek toward higher elevations and another that cut west into denser forest. Michael took the creek path, his flashlight beam cutting through the mist and illuminating the narrow dirt trail ahead. The sound of water moving over rocks was constant, a low murmur that was both calming and isolating. There were no other sounds, no distant traffic, no voices, just the wilderness and the steady rhythm of Michael's boots on the trail. At 10:23 p.m., Michael radioed dispatch again. This time, there was a subtle change in his tone, not alarm exactly, but a focused intensity that suggested he'd found something. He reported that he'd located evidence of a recent campfire approximately 0.6 miles up the trail, just off the main path near a bend in the creek. The fire pit was fresh, he said, with ash that was still warm to the touch. Nearby, he'd found what appeared to be animal traps, wire snares, of the type used for catching small to medium-sized game. The traps were illegal in the park, and their placement suggested someone who knew what they were doing and wasn't concerned about being caught. Michael told dispatch he was going to investigate further, collect evidence, and see if he could determine which direction the person or persons responsible had gone. He estimated he'd need about 30 minutes and would check back in then. The dispatcher acknowledged, logged the report, and waited. 30 minutes passed, then 45. By 11:15 p.m., the dispatcher tried to raise Michael on the radio. No response. She tried again at 11:30, and then every 10 minutes after that. Each time, there was only static. This wasn't entirely unusual. The park's terrain created dead zones where radio signals couldn't penetrate, especially in the deeper valleys and near the creek where rock formations and dense tree cover blocked transmissions. But Michael knew those dead zones, and he usually positioned himself to maintain contact or warned dispatch in advance if he was going into an area with poor coverage. His silence was concerning, but not yet alarming. The dispatcher continued her attempts to reach him while monitoring the clock. By midnight, Michael was officially overdue for check-in. By 1 in the morning, he'd missed his scheduled return to the station by an hour. At 1:45 a.m., with still no word from Michael, the park's night supervisor made the decision to contact the county sheriff's office. Something was wrong. Michael was too experienced, too reliable, to simply go silent without explanation. A deputy was dispatched to the park, and by 2:30 a.m., the deputy and the night supervisor were driving the park's access roads, checking trailheads, and calling Michael's name over loudspeakers. There was no response, no sign of him. At 4:15 a.m., they found Michael's patrol vehicle exactly where he'd left it at the Blackwater Creek trailhead. The vehicle was unlocked, the keys still in the ignition. Michael's radio, the vehicle-mounted unit he'd used to call in his reports, sat in its cradle on the dashboard. His jacket was draped over the passenger seat. Everything looked normal, organized, exactly as a ranger would leave their vehicle before heading out on a foot patrol. But Michael himself was nowhere to be found, and his absence was now impossible to explain away as a radio malfunction or a decision to stay out longer than planned. The deputy immediately called for backup. By 5 in the morning, as the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the forest canopy, additional sheriff's deputies and park rangers were arriving at the trailhead. A search team was assembled quickly, 8 people initially, equipped with flashlights, radios, and first aid gear. They started up the trail that Michael had taken, calling his name, listening for any response. The morning was utterly still, the forest quiet except for the creek and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. About half a mile up the trail, one of the searchers found Michael's flashlight. It was lying in the middle of the path, partially obscured by fallen leaves, but still functioning. The beam pointed off into the underbrush, creating a pale cone of light against the dark vegetation. The searcher called out to the others, and they converged on the spot. The flashlight was a heavy maglite, the kind that could double as a defensive weapon, and it showed no signs of damage. The batteries were still good, and it appeared to have simply been dropped or placed there deliberately. But why would Michael drop his flashlight? And if he dropped it, why was it still on? Rangers were trained to preserve battery life, and leaving a flashlight on unnecessarily wasn't something Michael would do. The area around the flashlight was examined carefully. The trail at that point was relatively flat and clear, with no obstacles that would cause someone to stumble. There were no signs of a struggle, no disturbed earth, no broken branches, no scuff marks suggesting a fight or a fall. There was no blood. The leaves and dirt on the trail were undisturbed except for the footprints left by the search team. It was as if Michael had been walking along, had dropped or set down his flashlight, and then had simply continued without it. But that made no sense. Without a flashlight, the trail was pitch black at night. Even someone who knew the area as well as Michael did wouldn't willingly proceed without a light source. By 6 in the morning, word had spread through the small community surrounding Cascade Ridge State Park. Michael Durant was missing. Volunteers began arriving to help with the search. Other rangers, local hunters and hikers who knew the area, members of the county search and rescue team. By 7, there were over 30 people combing the trails, spreading out in a grid pattern, checking every ravine and creek bed, calling Michael's name until their voices went hoarse. By midday, helicopters joined the search, flying low over the canopy with thermal imaging cameras, looking for any heat signature that might indicate a person. Dogs were brought in, given Michael's scent from clothing in his locker at the ranger station, and they tracked along the trail to the point where the flashlight had been found, and then they lost the scent. The dogs circled, confused, unable to pick up a trail leading away from that spot in any direction. The discovery of the campfire and the traps that Michael had reported was confirmed by investigators later that morning. The fire pit was exactly where Michael had described it, still containing warm ash. The illegal snares were collected as evidence, but they revealed nothing about who had set them or where that person might be now. More troubling was the realization that if Michael had encountered the person responsible for the traps, there was no evidence of that encounter. No signs of confrontation, No indication that anyone else had been on that trail in the hours after Michael radioed in his last report. As the search continued through the day and into the evening of November 9th, the questions multiplied. Michael Durant had walked into the forest with all his training, all his knowledge of the terrain, and all his equipment except for the flashlight he'd somehow lost or abandoned half a mile from his vehicle. And then, he had vanished, leaving behind no footprints leading off the trail, no signs of an accident or an attack, and no explanation for how an experienced ranger could disappear so completely in a wilderness he'd called his workplace for nearly a decade. The forest kept its secrets, and Michael Durant was somewhere within it, lost, injured, or worse, and no one could find him. The search for Michael Durant began in earnest at first light on November 9th, 2016, less than 12 hours after he'd failed to return from his patrol. By 7 in the morning, over 40 people were spread across the northern trail system of Cascade Ridge State Park, moving methodically through the forest in organized search patterns. The county sheriff's office had mobilized its search and rescue team, bringing in experienced trackers, K-9 units trained in wilderness recovery, and technical climbers who could navigate the steeper, more dangerous sections of terrain. The Washington State Patrol provided helicopter support, and volunteer groups from surrounding counties arrived throughout the morning, eager to help find a ranger who many of them knew personally or by reputation. Michael's wife, Sarah Durant, was brought to the park headquarters along with their 2 young daughters, ages 6 and 8. Sarah was 32 years old, a school counselor in the nearby town of Riverside, and she'd been married to Michael for 10 years. When park officials had called her at 3 in the morning to tell her Michael hadn't returned from patrol and wasn't responding to radio calls, her first reaction had been disbelief. Michael was too careful, too experienced for something like this to happen. But as the hours passed and the sun rose over the mountains without any word, disbelief gave way to a creeping dread that settled in her chest and wouldn't leave. She sat in a small office at the headquarters, her daughters with her, trying to keep them calm while she fell apart inside. Park staff brought her coffee and updates every hour, but the updates were always the same, still searching, no sign of him yet, trying everything they can. The search focused initially on the area where Michael's flashlight had been found, approximately half a mile up the Blackwater Creek Trail. Teams fanned out from that point in every direction, moving slowly through the underbrush, checking behind trees and under fallen logs, calling Michael's name in coordinated intervals so their voices wouldn't overlap and mask a potential response. The terrain in that section was relatively manageable, forested but not impossibly dense, with visibility extending 20 to 30 feet in most directions. If Michael had been injured and unable to move, if he'd collapsed from a medical emergency or fallen and hit his head, he should have been findable. But as the morning stretched into afternoon, no trace of him emerged. The tracking dogs were brought in around 10 in the morning. 2 German shepherds trained in wilderness search, both with years of experience finding lost hikers and hunters. The handlers gave the dogs articles of Michael's clothing, a shirt from his locker at the ranger station, and released them at the point where the flashlight had been discovered. The dogs immediately picked up a scent and began moving up the trail with purpose, their noses to the ground, their handlers following closely behind. The dogs led the searchers another quarter-mile up the trail, past the point where Michael had reported finding the campfire and the illegal traps. The terrain here began to change, becoming steeper and rockier. The creek narrowed and deepened, cutting through a small gorge lined with moss-covered boulders and exposed tree roots. About 3/4 of a mile from Michael's vehicle, near a distinctive rocky outcropping that jutted from the hillside like a broken tooth, the dogs stopped. They circled the area, sniffing the ground, the rocks, the air. They whined and paced, clearly confused. The handlers encouraged them, tried to get them to pick up the trail again, but the dogs couldn't. It was as if Michael's scent simply ended at that spot. One of the handlers, a woman named Linda Pierce who'd worked with search dogs for 15 years, later told investigators that she'd never seen anything quite like it. Dogs lose scent trails for understandable reasons. Water washes it away, strong winds disperse it, or the subject gets into a vehicle. But here, there was no water deep enough to wade through. The night had been still with minimal wind, and there were no roads or vehicle access points anywhere near this location. Michael's scent should have continued in some direction, but it didn't. It just stopped. Searchers examined the rocky outcropping carefully. The area was treacherous, with steep drop-offs on one side that fell 30 feet into a tangle of deadfall and boulders. It was possible Michael had fallen, though there were no signs of disturbed earth or broken vegetation that would indicate someone tumbling down the slope. Technical climbers rappelled down into the ravine below the outcropping, searching every crevice and shadowed space where a body might have landed. They found nothing. No equipment, no torn clothing, no blood, no indication that anyone had fallen or been injured there. As the search expanded over the following days, investigators began interviewing everyone who'd had contact with Michael in the hours before his disappearance. His fellow rangers painted a consistent picture of a man who was competent, careful, and deeply familiar with his work environment. Josh Martinez, a ranger who'd been working the southern section of the park that night, had been monitoring the radio and had heard Michael's last check-in at 10:23 p.m. Josh told investigators that Michael had sounded completely normal, calm, professional, focused on the task at hand. There had been no tension in his voice, no indication that he felt threatened or in danger. He'd simply reported finding evidence of illegal activity and stated his intention to investigate further. Nothing in that communication suggested what was about to happen. Michael's supervisor, a veteran ranger named Tom Hendricks, who'd known Michael for all 9 years of his service, struggled to make sense of the disappearance. Tom told investigators that Michael was one of the most reliable rangers on staff. He didn't take unnecessary risks. He followed protocols. He knew when to call for backup and when to retreat from a potentially dangerous situation. The idea that Michael would put himself in jeopardy by confronting armed poachers alone didn't fit with his personality or training. And if Michael had encountered someone hostile, why was there no evidence of confrontation? No discharged weapon, no signs of a struggle, no indication that anything violent had occurred. Investigators explored every possible scenario. The most obvious was that Michael had suffered some kind of accident, fallen into a hidden crevasse or ravine that the searchers hadn't found yet. But the terrain had been searched thoroughly, and the areas steep enough to hide a body had been checked multiple times by climbers and dogs. Another theory was that Michael had become injured and disoriented, perhaps from a head injury, and had wandered deeper into the wilderness in a confused state. This was more plausible, but still didn't account for the complete absence of tracks or signs of movement beyond the point where the dogs lost his scent. A head injury severe enough to cause disorientation would likely have left blood at the scene, and there was none. A darker theory suggested foul play. Perhaps Michael had confronted whoever was responsible for the illegal traps, and that person had harmed him either in self-defense or in an attempt to avoid arrest. But this theory had problems too. Michael was armed and trained. If he'd been attacked, he would have fought back or at minimum tried to radio for help. His radio, though left in his vehicle, could have been reached quickly if he'd retreated. And if someone had killed him and hidden the body, how had they done so without leaving any evidence? No drag marks, no additional footprints, no disturbance of the surrounding area. It was as if Michael had simply ceased to exist at that rocky outcropping, his physical presence erased from the landscape. As November turned to December, the search efforts began to scale back. The weather deteriorated, with temperatures dropping into the 20s at night and snow beginning to fall in the higher elevations. The volunteers who'd spent weeks combing the forest had to return to their jobs and their lives. The professional search and rescue teams had other emergencies to respond to. The park rangers continued to patrol the area, always looking, always hoping to find something that would explain what had happened. But as weeks passed without any new discoveries, the searches became less frequent, more symbolic than practical. By mid-December 2016, the active search for Michael Durant was officially suspended. The case remained open, classified as a missing person under suspicious but unexplained circumstances. Michael's personnel file was flagged, his payroll suspended, and his locker at the ranger station left untouched in case he somehow returned. But no one really believed he would. Everyone connected to the case, the investigators, the rangers, the searchers, knew in their hearts that Michael was gone, likely dead, somewhere in that 12,000-acre wilderness. They just didn't know where, or how, or why. Sarah Durant and her daughters faced a nightmare that had no resolution. There was no body to bury, no funeral to plan, no closure to help them begin grieving. Michael was simply gone, and the not knowing was a special kind of torture. Sarah couldn't sell their house or access certain financial accounts without a death certificate, which couldn't be issued without a body or evidence of death. She couldn't tell her daughters definitively that their father wasn't coming home, because technically, no one could prove he was dead. The girls asked when Daddy would be back. Sarah didn't have an answer. Michael's fellow Rangers were haunted in different ways. They'd lost a colleague, a friend, someone they'd trusted to watch their backs in the wilderness. But more than that, they'd lost their sense of security in a place they'd always believed they understood. Cascade Ridge State Park had been their workplace, familiar and manageable. But Michael's disappearance changed that. The forest suddenly felt darker, more threatening, less knowable. Rangers who'd patrolled solo for years began requesting partners. Night shifts became assignments no one wanted. There was an unspoken belief among the staff that the park had done something to Michael, had taken him deliberately, though no one could articulate what that meant or how it could be true. They just knew that one of their own had walked into that wilderness and had never walked back out, and the forest had offered no explanation, no evidence, no trace of what it had done with him. The silence was absolute, and in that silence, fear grew. The years after Michael Durant's disappearance moved with a slow, relentless progression that brought no answers and no relief. By the spring of 2017, 6 months after Michael had vanished, the investigation had effectively stalled. Detectives had interviewed over 60 people, every ranger who'd worked with Michael, every person known to have been in the park that week, every hunter and hiker whose vehicle had been logged at trailhead parking areas in the days before and after November 8th. They'd followed up on dozens of tips called into the sheriff's office, most of them well-intentioned but ultimately useless. Psychics had volunteered their services, claiming to sense Michael's presence in various locations, and though investigators were skeptical, they checked every site the psychics mentioned. They found nothing. Sarah Durant tried to hold her life together for the sake of her daughters, but the weight of not knowing crushed her spirit a little more each day. The house she and Michael had bought together felt like a museum to a life that had been interrupted mid-sentence. His tools were still in the garage. His clothes still hung in the closet. His coffee mug, the one with the Park Service logo that he used every morning, sat in the kitchen cabinet waiting for him to come home and fill it. Sarah couldn't bring herself to pack his things away, but she also couldn't stand living among the constant reminders of his absence. By the fall of 2018, 2 years after Michael disappeared, Sarah made the painful decision to move. She accepted a job as a school counselor in Portland, Oregon, over 200 miles away, and relocated with her daughters. She needed distance from Cascade Ridge, from the park, from the community where everyone knew her as the ranger's wife whose husband had vanished. She needed to start over somewhere no one would ask her if there was any news, because there never was. The park itself continued to operate, trails open to the public, rangers patrolling on rotating shifts. But something had fundamentally changed. The staff who'd worked with Michael Josh Martinez, Tom Hendricks, and several others couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had become hostile in some indefinable way. Night patrols, once routine assignments that rangers took in stride, became shifts no one wanted. The northern trail system where Michael had disappeared saw significantly less foot traffic, not because it was closed, but because rangers found reasons to patrol other areas instead. When someone did have to cover the Blackwater Creek trails at night, they went in pairs. No one said it outright, but everyone understood you didn't go into that part of the park alone after dark. Not anymore. Not after what had happened to Michael. Detective Linda Reeves, the lead investigator on the case, found herself unable to let it go even as years passed. Linda was 54 years old in 2016 when Michael disappeared, a 26-year veteran of the county sheriff's office who'd worked everything from domestic violence cases to homicides. She'd seen her share of tragedies and mysteries, but Michael Durant's disappearance affected her differently. It wasn't just the lack of evidence that bothered her, though that was maddening in itself. It was the impossibility of the whole situation. A trained ranger, armed and equipped, familiar with every inch of the terrain, doesn't just vanish. He encounters something. Something happens to him, and there should be evidence of that something, but there wasn't. Linda retired from the sheriff's office in 2020, handing off her active cases to younger detectives. But she kept the Durant file. She had copies of everything: witness statements, search reports, topographic maps, photos of the scene. She kept the file in a cardboard box in her home office, and on quiet afternoons when she had nothing else occupying her mind, she'd pull it out and review it again, hoping to see something she'd missed the first 100 times. She never did. The case generated occasional bursts of media attention, usually around the anniversary of Michael's disappearance. Local news stations in Washington would run segments on November 8th, recapping the story, showing photos of Michael in his ranger uniform, interviewing family members or former colleagues who were willing to talk. The coverage always ended with a plea for information, a phone number for the tip line, and the acknowledgement that the case remained unsolved. True crime podcasts discovered the story and dedicated episodes to exploring the various theories. The hosts would lay out the known facts: Michael's last radio call, the discovered flashlight, the point where the tracking dogs lost his scent, and then speculate endlessly about what might have happened. Some episodes were respectful and well-researched. Others were sensationalistic, more interested in manufacturing mystery than uncovering truth. The most prevalent theory among serious investigators was that Michael had been murdered by whoever was running the illegal trapping operation he'd discovered. The logic was straightforward. Michael had reported finding evidence of poaching and had stated his intention to investigate further. He'd likely encountered the person responsible, and that person, facing arrest and significant criminal charges, had attacked him. Perhaps it had been self-defense from the poacher's perspective, or perhaps it had been premeditated murder to eliminate a witness. In this scenario, the poacher had then hidden Michael's body so effectively that years of searching hadn't uncovered it. The park's 12,000 acres offered plenty of places to conceal a body: deep ravines, caves, thick underbrush, areas so remote that even experienced searchers would struggle to access them. This theory was plausible but frustrating, because without a body and without identifying the poacher, there was no way to prove it. Another theory, favored by some of Michael's colleagues and by medical professionals consulted during the investigation, was that Michael had suffered a sudden medical emergency: a stroke, a seizure, an aneurysm, something that would have incapacitated him quickly and without warning. In this scenario, Michael had become disoriented, had wandered off the trail in a confused state, and had eventually succumbed to his condition somewhere in the wilderness. His body, according to this theory, was out there waiting to be found, perhaps in a location just off the beaten path that searchers had overlooked. This theory explained the lack of evidence of violence or struggle, but it struggled to account for why the tracking dogs had lost his scent so abruptly and why an experienced ranger would drop his flashlight and continue without it, even in a disoriented state. More outlandish theories emerged online, particularly on true crime forums and social media groups dedicated to unsolved mysteries. Some users suggested that Michael had faked his own disappearance, that he'd had secret reasons to vanish: debts, affairs, a desire to escape his life, and had staged the whole thing. These theories pointed to the lack of a body as evidence that Michael wasn't actually dead, but rather living under a new identity somewhere far from Washington. Other theories ventured into conspiracy territory, suggesting Michael had stumbled onto illegal activity far more serious than poaching, drug operations, human trafficking, even government black sites, and had been silenced to protect those operations. A few theories abandoned plausibility entirely, speculating about paranormal abduction or encounters with cryptids supposedly inhabiting the Cascade Wilderness. These theories, especially the ones suggesting Michael had faked his disappearance, caused immense pain to his family. Sarah Durant, trying to rebuild her life in Portland, would occasionally see her husband's name trending on social media, and she'd click through to find strangers debating whether Michael had been a loving father or a man running from his responsibilities. She'd read posts claiming that his disappearance was too convenient, that the lack of evidence proved he'd planned it, that he was probably living on a beach somewhere, laughing about how well he'd fooled everyone. The cruelty of these speculations was devastating. Sarah knew the truth: Michael had loved his family, had been devoted to his work, had no reason to vanish. His personnel file with the Park Service was spotless, documenting 9 years of excellent performance reviews and commendations. His finances, examined thoroughly by investigators, showed nothing unusual: no secret accounts, no large withdrawals, no evidence of hidden debts or criminal activity. His marriage, according to everyone who knew the couple, had been stable and happy. Michael Durant hadn't been running from anything. Something had happened to him, something terrible, and the fact that his wife and daughters had to defend his memory against baseless online theories added another layer of trauma to their loss. In 2021, 5 years after Michael's disappearance, Cascade Ridge State Park made a significant infrastructure investment. Park management approved the installation of a comprehensive network of trail cameras throughout the northern section of the park, particularly along the Blackwater Creek Trail system where Michael had last been seen. The official justification was wildlife monitoring. The cameras would capture data on animal populations, migration patterns, and habitat use that would inform conservation decisions. But everyone involved in the decision understood the unspoken secondary purpose. The cameras were surveillance, a way to document who and what moved through those trails, a safeguard against another disappearance going unwitnessed. The cameras were motion-activated units capable of capturing both still photographs and video. They were mounted on trees at strategic points, trailheads, intersections, areas with known wildlife activity, and specifically near the rocky outcropping where the tracking dogs had lost Michael's scent. The park installed over 30 cameras in the northern section alone, creating a web of coverage that would theoretically capture anyone or anything passing through. The cameras were weatherproofed, equipped with infrared for night imaging, and designed to operate for months on battery power before requiring service. For 2 years, the cameras did exactly what they were designed to do. They captured thousands of images and hundreds of hours of video. Park staff reviewed the footage on a rotating basis, fast-forwarding through endless recordings of empty trails, pausing occasionally when motion was detected. They saw deer moving through the forest in herds, their eyes glowing white in the infrared. They saw elk, bears foraging for berries, coyotes trotting along the trails at dawn. They saw hikers and mountain bikers, families with children, solo backpackers, all moving through the park doing exactly what visitors were supposed to do. They saw weather, rain, and snow captured in grainy time-lapse, wind-bending trees, fog rolling through the valleys. They saw nothing unusual, nothing threatening, nothing that explained what had happened to Michael Durant. The cameras became routine, part of the park's operational infrastructure, checked periodically but largely taken for granted. The initial hope that they might capture something revelatory faded as months of mundane footage accumulated. By 2023, 7 years after Michael's disappearance, the case had settled into the category of cold but not forgotten, a mystery that defined Cascade Ridge State Park in the memories of those who'd worked there when it happened, but a mystery that seemed destined to remain forever unsolved. The forest had kept its secret for 7 years, and with each passing season, the likelihood of answers grew dimmer, buried under layers of time and the relentless march of life moving forward without Michael Durant. October 2023 brought an early cold snap to Cascade Ridge State Park, with temperatures dropping into the 40s at night and frost covering the ground by morning. David Chen, a 46-year-old maintenance worker who'd been with the Park Service for 12 years, was sitting in the small equipment building that served as the park's maintenance hub, scrolling through trail camera footage on a desktop computer. It was a task he found tedious but necessary. The cameras generated enormous amounts of data, and someone had to review it periodically to identify wildlife patterns, check for equipment malfunctions, and occasionally catch people violating park regulations. Most of the footage was exactly what you'd expect: deer, the occasional bear, hikers staying on designated trails. David had learned to fast forward through hours of empty forest, slowing down only when the motion detection timestamp indicated activity. He was working his way through footage from a camera positioned along the Blackwater Creek Trail, one of the 30 units installed in 2021 as part of the park's surveillance upgrade. The camera was mounted about 8 feet up a Douglas fir, angled to capture a straight section of trail roughly 50 yards in length. David had reviewed footage from this camera before it was in a high-traffic area and regularly captured hikers and wildlife. But today he was working through a backlog of files that had accumulated when the park's IT department had performed a system upgrade earlier in the year. As part of that upgrade, they downloaded all historical data from older cameras that had occupied the same locations before the 2021 installation. The previous generation of cameras had been installed in 2014 and had operated until they were replaced, but their footage had been stored on local memory cards rather than uploaded to a central server. Much of that data had never been properly reviewed. It had simply sat on memory cards in a storage closet until the IT upgrade prompted someone to finally extract and archive it. David was scrolling through files dated from 2016, not expecting to find anything significant. The footage was lower resolution than the current cameras, grainier, with less effective night vision. He was about to skip ahead when something made him stop. The timestamp on the file read the 8th of November 2016. 10:41 p.m. David sat up straighter in his chair. The 8th of November 2016. That was the night Michael Durant had disappeared. David had been working at the park then, though he'd been on vacation that week and hadn't been part of the initial search efforts. But he knew the story. Everyone who worked at Cascade Ridge knew the story. He moved his mouse to play the video. The footage began with an empty trail, illuminated only by the camera's infrared imaging, which rendered everything in shades of gray and white. Trees lined both sides of the trail, their trunks appearing as dark vertical columns against the lighter background of forest floor and vegetation. For several seconds, nothing moved. Then, at the bottom edge of the frame, a figure appeared. David leaned closer to the screen. The figure was walking up the trail toward the camera, moving at a steady pace. Even in the grainy infrared footage, David could tell it was a park ranger. The uniform was distinctive, the posture professional. The figure carried a flashlight, the beam visible as a bright cone of light sweeping back and forth across the trail ahead. As the figure moved closer to the camera's position, more details became visible. The ranger was male, medium build, moving with the confident gait of someone who knew exactly where he was and what he was doing. David's pulse quickened. This had to be Michael Durant. The date, the time, the location, it all matched the timeline of his disappearance. David watched as Michael continued up the trail. His flashlight beam swept methodically left, center, right, scanning for whatever he'd reported finding earlier that evening. The illegal traps, the campfire. Evidence of poaching. Michael was about 30 yards from the camera's position when something happened that made David's breath catch in his throat. Michael stopped walking. His entire body went still, his flashlight beam freezing in place, pointed off to the left of the trail into the trees. His head turned in that direction, his shoulders squaring as if he were focusing intently on something the camera couldn't capture. The angle was wrong. Whatever Michael was looking at was outside the camera's field of view, somewhere in the darkness beyond the frame. For several seconds, Michael just stood there, motionless, his flashlight aimed at something in the trees. Then his body language shifted in a way that was unmistakable even in the low-quality footage. He took a step backward, his free hand, the one not holding the flashlight, moved to his hip, reaching for his sidearm. Michael wasn't drawing the weapon, but his hand was on it, ready. Whatever he was looking at had made him feel threatened. David watched as Michael remained frozen in that position for 8 seconds. David counted them 8 seconds of Michael Durant staring at something off camera, his hand on his gun, his body tense. Then Michael turned. Not slowly, but not in panic either. He turned and began moving back down the trail, away from whatever he'd seen, retracing his path. He was moving faster than a casual walk, but he wasn't running. It was the movement of someone executing a tactical retreat, trying to create distance from a threat while maintaining awareness and control. Michael walked quickly out of the camera's frame, disappearing back down the trail in the direction of his vehicle. David sat staring at the empty trail on the screen, his mind racing. Michael had seen something that had made an experienced, armed ranger back away and retreat. But what? The camera hadn't captured it. Whatever it was had been off to the side, in the trees, outside the field of view. David's finger hovered over the mouse, about to close the file, when the timestamp caught his eye. The video was still running. He let it play. For 3 minutes and 17 seconds, the footage showed nothing but empty trail. David was about to stop it when movement appeared at the bottom of the frame. Another figure was moving up the trail, walking in the same direction Michael had been heading before he'd retreated. David leaned so close to the screen his nose almost touched it. The figure was wrong. That was the first thought that struck him, visceral and immediate. The figure was approximately human-sized, but the way it moved was awkward, lurching, as if its joints didn't bend quite right, or as if each step required conscious effort. It wasn't in a ranger uniform. The clothing appeared dark and shapeless, impossible to distinguish in the infrared imaging. The figure was too far from the camera and too obscured by the limitations of the night vision to make out any facial features or identifying characteristics. It moved up the trail at a pace that was neither fast nor slow, just steady and wrong, and then it passed out of frame, heading in the direction Michael had been walking before whatever he'd seen had made him retreat. The footage ended, the file stopped, and the video player returned to the file list. David sat in silence, his heart pounding, staring at the black screen. He replayed the video, then he replayed it again. Each time, the sequence was the same: Michael walking, stopping, reacting to something, retreating, empty trail, strange figure following. David checked the timestamp and the camera location data embedded in the file. There was no question this footage was from the 8th of November 2016, the night Michael Durant disappeared, captured by a camera less than a mile from where his flashlight had been found. This was the last video recording of Michael Durant alive, and it showed him encountering something that had frightened him enough to retreat. And then something else, something David couldn't identify and didn't want to think too hard about, had followed the same path minutes later. David stood up from his desk, his legs unsteady. He walked to the door of the equipment building and stepped outside, needing air, needing to think. It was mid-afternoon, the park quiet between the lunch-hour hikers and the evening crowd. He pulled out his phone and called his supervisor, the park's operations manager. His voice was shaking as he explained what he'd found. The supervisor told him not to touch anything, not to share the footage with anyone, and said he'd be there in 10 minutes. David went back inside and sat down at his computer, staring at the frozen final frame of the video, the dark, lurching figure disappearing up the trail. The operations manager arrived and watched the footage 3 times without speaking. Then he made a phone call to the park's regional director. Within 2 hours, county sheriff's deputies were at the park. By evening, retired Detective Linda Reeves, who hadn't set foot in Cascade Ridge State Park since her retirement 3 years earlier, was standing in the equipment building, watching the same footage David had discovered, her face pale and her hands trembling slightly. She watched it over and over, her trained investigator's eyes cataloging every detail, every frame. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet and strained. She said they needed to get this footage to forensic video analysts immediately, and they needed to figure out what the hell Michael Durant had seen in those trees that night, because whatever it was, it had terrified an experienced ranger enough to make him retreat. And whatever came after him, that figure with the wrong gait, moving through the darkness 3 minutes later, had been following him. After 7 years of silence, the forest had finally given up a piece of its secret, captured on infrared video and hidden on a forgotten memory card. And what it revealed was more disturbing than anyone had imagined. The discovery of the trail camera footage detonated like a bomb through the cold case of Michael Durant's disappearance. Within 24 hours of David Chen finding the video, the county sheriff's office had formally reopened the investigation. Linda Reeves, who had spent 3 years in retirement unable to forget the ranger who'd vanished without explanation, received a call from the current sheriff asking if she'd be willing to return as a consultant. Linda didn't hesitate. She'd waited 7 years for a break in this case, and now that it had finally come, she wasn't going to watch from the sidelines. By the morning of October 18th, 2023, Linda was back in the conference room at the sheriff's office that had served as the command center in 2016, surrounded by detectives and analysts, the trail camera footage playing on a large monitor mounted on the wall. The video was sent to the Washington State Patrol's Forensic Video Analysis Unit, where specialists with expertise in enhancing and interpreting surveillance footage began their work. The process took days. The analysts worked frame by frame, applying filters and enhancement algorithms to extract every possible detail from the grainy infrared recording. They measured the first figure, the one identified as Michael Durant, against known reference points in the frame, calculating height and build. Their analysis confirmed what everyone already believed. The figure was consistent with Michael Durant's documented height of 6 feet 1 inch and his medium athletic build. The uniform was standard park ranger issue, and the equipment flashlight, duty belt, sidearm, matched what Michael would have been carrying that night. But it was Michael's behavior that told the real story. The analysts noted the precise moment when Michael stopped walking, the way his body language shifted from purposeful movement to sudden alert stillness. They tracked his head turning towards something off-camera to his left, his hand moving to his holstered weapon. The body language experts brought in to review the footage were unanimous in their interpretation. Michael Durant was reacting to a perceived threat. His posture, the speed of his hand moving toward his gun, the way he stepped backward while keeping his eyes fixed on whatever he was looking at, these were the actions of someone who'd encountered danger and was preparing to defend himself if necessary. When Michael turned and began retreating down the trail, his movement pattern was consistent with what law enforcement trainers call a tactical withdrawal, creating distance from a threat while maintaining awareness and readiness to respond. The second figure in the video presented more challenges. The forensic analysts enhanced the footage as much as the technology and the source material allowed, but the figure remained frustratingly obscured. It appeared at the far edge of the camera's effective range, moving through deep shadow, and the infrared imaging couldn't resolve fine details at that distance. What they could determine was limited but disturbing. The figure was wearing dark clothing, not a uniform, not the reflective gear that hikers typically wore, just dark, shapeless clothing that absorbed rather than reflected the infrared light. The figure's height was estimated at between 5 feet 8 inches and 6 feet, making it consistent with an average adult male or a taller female. But the margin of error was significant given the distance and angle. The movement pattern was what drew the most attention and the most concern. The forensic team brought in kinesiologist specialists in human movement to analyze the figure's gait. The kinesiologists reviewed the footage repeatedly, tracking the figure's stride length, the timing of each step, the way weight was transferred from one leg to the other. Their conclusion was cautious but troubling. The gait was abnormal. It didn't match the typical walking pattern of a healthy adult moving through moderately difficult terrain. The kinesiologist proposed several possible explanations. The figure might have been injured, favoring one leg, or dealing with pain that affected their movement. They might have been intoxicated or impaired by drugs, which would explain the awkward, lurching quality. They might have been carrying something heavy that threw off their balance and altered their natural stride. Or, and this was the explanation that no one wanted to voice, but everyone was thinking, the figure might have been moving strangely for reasons that had nothing to do with injury or intoxication, reasons that suggested something fundamentally wrong about whoever or whatever was walking up that trail. The timeline became critical to understanding what had happened. Investigators laid out every known data point in sequence. At 10:23 p.m. on the 8th of November 2016, Michael Durant made his last radio call, reporting that he'd found evidence of illegal camping and traps and stating his intention to investigate further. 18 minutes later, at 10:41 p.m., the trail camera captured him moving up the trail, encountering something that made him stop and retreat. The camera was positioned approximately 0.8 miles from where Michael's flashlight would later be found, which meant Michael had traveled that distance after his last radio call. But he never radioed again. He never returned to his vehicle. Somewhere between 10:41 p.m., when the camera showed him retreating, and dawn the next morning, when searchers found his abandoned patrol vehicle, Michael Durant had vanished. The prevailing theory that emerged from the investigation team was brutal in its simplicity. Michael had encountered someone on that trail, most likely the person responsible for the illegal traps he'd discovered. That person had been armed or had presented enough of a threat that Michael, an experienced ranger who'd handled confrontations before, had decided to retreat rather than engage. Michael had backed away, moving down the trail toward his vehicle, intending to call for backup or simply leave the area and return with support. But something had gone wrong. Either he'd been pursued, or he'd been cut off, or he'd become injured while retreating through the dark forest. Somehow, Michael had been pulled, or had wandered away from the trail, deeper into the wilderness, where he'd died from his injuries, or from exposure, or from violence inflicted by whoever he'd encountered. It was a theory built on logic and the limited evidence available, but it was still just a theory. They needed more. They needed proof. On October 20th, 2023, search teams returned to Cascade Ridge State Park. The operation was different from the massive effort in 2016. This wasn't a search for a missing person who might still be alive. This was a recovery operation, a search for human remains. The teams were smaller, experienced searchers, cadaver dogs, forensic specialists, prepared to process a death scene. They started at the location where the trail camera had captured Michael retreating, and they expanded outward, focusing on the terrain that Michael would have crossed if he'd continued moving away from whatever he'd encountered. The forest was denser here, the undergrowth thick with ferns and blackberry brambles, the ground uneven and treacherous. It was the kind of terrain where someone disoriented or injured could easily become lost, where a body could lie undiscovered for years. The search was methodical and slow. Teams moved in grid patterns, checking every ravine, every dense thicket, every place where a person might have fallen or taken shelter. The cadaver dogs worked the area, trained to detect the scent of human decomposition even after years of exposure to the elements. For 2 weeks, the teams found nothing. The forest yielded deer carcasses, old camping gear left behind by hikers, the rusted remains of illegal animal traps that might have been the same ones Michael had reported, but no trace of the missing ranger. By early November, the search seemed destined to end the same way it had in 2016, with questions and frustration and no answers. Then, on November 3, 2023, almost exactly 7 years after Michael Durant disappeared, a search team working approximately 1.2 miles from the trail camera location found something. They were moving through a steep ravine, an area so choked with fallen trees and undergrowth that it would have been nearly impossible to navigate at night. One of the searchers, a county deputy named Marcus Webb, was working his way along the bottom of the ravine when his boot caught on something buried under a mat of decomposed leaves and vegetation. He knelt down and carefully brushed away the organic debris. What he uncovered made him immediately call for the forensic team. The remains were scattered, pulled apart by wildlife over the course of 7 years. Bones, a femur, ribs, vertebrae lay partially buried under leaf litter and moss. Fragments of fabric clung to some of the bones, the material rotted and discolored but still recognizable as the dark blue of a park ranger uniform. Near what appeared to be the main concentration of remains, searchers found a corroded leather duty belt with a metal buckle that had survived the elements, and half buried in the soil, tangled in the roots of a young fir tree, they found a handgun. The weapon was heavily corroded, the grip rotted away, but the serial number stamped into the metal of the slide was still visible after careful cleaning. The site was treated as a crime scene. Forensic anthropologists were brought in to carefully excavate and document the remains. Every bone, every fragment of fabric, every personal item was photographed in place before being collected. The work took 3 days. The remains were skeletal, with no soft tissue remaining after 7 years of exposure to rain, snow, and scavengers. The bones showed evidence of animal activity, tooth marks from coyotes or bears, dispersal patterns consistent with scavengers moving parts of the body. But beneath that damage, the forensic team found something that made their work suddenly more urgent. Several of the ribs showed fresh breaks at the time of death, and one of the vertebrae had evidence of trauma consistent with blunt force impact. The handgun was sent to the lab for analysis. Despite the corrosion, the serial number was matched against Park Service records. It was Michael Durant's issued sidearm, the weapon he'd been carrying the night he disappeared. The gun had been fired. Forensic analysis revealed residue in the barrel and chamber, but it was impossible to determine when or at what. If Michael had fired his weapon during whatever confrontation had occurred, no casings had been found, and no other evidence of a shooting existed. The remains were transported to the county medical examiner's office, where forensic odontology dental identification provided the final confirmation. The dental structures, though damaged, matched Michael Durant's dental records perfectly. After 7 years of being missing, after 7 years of his family living in uncertainty and his colleagues haunted by his disappearance, Michael Durant had been found. He'd been less than 2 miles from where his patrol vehicle had been parked, lying in a ravine so hidden that even extensive searches had missed it. The forest had kept him all this time, had slowly reclaimed his remains, and had finally given him back only when technology that hadn't existed at the time of his death revealed where to look. The discovery of Michael Durant's remains brought answers that his family and colleagues had waited 7 years to receive, but those answers came wrapped in new questions that would likely never be fully resolved. The forensic analysis began immediately after the remains were transported to the county medical examiner's office. The work was painstaking and methodical, conducted by forensic anthropologists who specialized in examining skeletal remains and reconstructing the circumstances of death from what the bones could reveal. The bones told a story of trauma. Multiple fractures were documented across Michael's skeleton. Both legs showed breaks consistent with high-impact force. Several ribs were fractured, and the skull bore evidence of significant trauma. The patterns of injury were consistent with a fall from height, the kind of catastrophic impact that occurs when a body drops 10 or 15 feet and strikes hard ground or rocks. The medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Wong, who had been with the county for 18 years and had examined hundreds of deceased persons, reviewed the findings carefully. Her conclusion was that Michael Durant had fallen either accidentally or as a result of being pushed or forced into the ravine where his remains were discovered. The fall itself, or the injuries sustained from it, had been the cause of death. Based on the nature of the fractures and the location of the injuries, Dr. Wong estimated that death had occurred within hours of the fall, possibly sooner if the head trauma had been severe enough to cause immediate loss of consciousness or catastrophic brain injury. The location where Michael's remains were found supported this conclusion. The ravine was treacherous, a steep drop concealed by dense vegetation and fallen trees. During daylight, with someone specifically looking for it, the drop-off was visible and avoidable. But at night, even with a flashlight, the edge of the ravine would have been nearly impossible to see until it was too late. The undergrowth disguised the terrain, creating the illusion of solid ground that actually gave way to empty air and a 15-foot drop onto rocks and exposed roots. If Michael had been moving through that area in darkness, whether he was retreating from a threat, disoriented from a head injury, or simply trying to find his way back to the trail, he could have stepped over the edge without ever seeing it coming. This explained several of the mysteries that had haunted the investigation for 7 years. It explained why Michael never made another radio call after 10:23 p.m. if he fell sometime between then and when the trail camera captured him at 10:41 p.m., or shortly afterward. His radio would have been damaged in the fall, or he would have been too injured to operate it. It explained why he never returned to his vehicle. He was incapacitated at the bottom of a ravine 1.5 miles away. It explained why search dogs had lost his scent near the rocky outcropping that was roughly where Michael had left the maintained trail and entered the more rugged terrain that eventually led to the ravine. The bones provided answers, but they couldn't answer everything. They couldn't explain what Michael had encountered on that trail that made him react the way he did in the camera footage. They couldn't explain who or what the second figure was that had followed him up the trail 3 minutes later. Detective Linda Reeves and the investigation team focused their attention on identifying that second figure. They went back through every record from November 2016, re-interviewing people who'd been questioned then, searching for anyone who might have been in that section of the park that night. They reviewed the reports from the illegal trapping investigation that had never been completed after Michael disappeared. One name appeared in those old reports that suddenly took on new significance: Vincent Howell. Vincent had been 52 years old in 2016, a transient with a long history of drug addiction who'd been living illegally in the northern section of Cascade Ridge State Park for several months leading up to Michael's disappearance. Rangers had encountered him several times, warning him that camping in non-designated areas was prohibited, but Vincent had continued to evade them, moving deeper into the forest whenever authorities got close. Vincent Howell had been questioned briefly in November 2016 as part of the initial investigation. He'd been brought in 3 days after Michael disappeared, and he'd told investigators that he'd been in the park that night but in a different section, far from the Blackwater Creek Trail. He claimed he'd been camped near the southern boundary, several miles from where Michael had been patrolling. He couldn't provide witnesses to corroborate his story, but investigators at the time couldn't definitively disprove it either. With no evidence linking him to Michael's disappearance and no body to indicate a crime had been committed, Vincent had been released. He'd left the area shortly afterward, and the investigation had moved on to other leads that went nowhere. Now, in 2023, investigators wanted to question Vincent Howell again, this time with the trail camera footage and the knowledge of where Michael's remains had been found. They began the process of locating him, running his name through databases, checking arrest records and known addresses. What they discovered was that Vincent Howell was dead. He died in 2019, 4 years earlier, in a shelter in Spokane, Washington. The cause of death was listed as complications related to chronic liver disease and long-term substance abuse. Vincent had been 55 years old. Whatever knowledge he might have had about the night Michael Durant disappeared had died with him, and there was no way to question a dead man or compel him to tell the truth. But investigators didn't give up. They tracked down other individuals who'd known Vincent during his time at Cascade Ridge, other transients and homeless individuals who'd shared camps with him or encountered him in the years after Michael's disappearance. Several of these individuals were located through outreach programs and homeless services in Washington and Oregon. When detectives interviewed them and asked about Vincent Howell, a disturbing pattern emerged. Multiple people recalled Vincent talking about an encounter with a park ranger in November 2016. The details varied depending on who was telling the story and how much time had passed, but the core elements were consistent. Vincent had said he'd been confronted by a ranger while checking his traps, illegal snare traps he'd set to catch small game for food. Vincent had been high or drunk at the time, and when the ranger approached him, Vincent had reacted aggressively. He'd talked about defending his territory, about making it clear that he wasn't going to be pushed out of the forest by some uniform with a badge. He'd never explicitly confessed to harming anyone, and some of the people who'd heard these stories thought Vincent was exaggerating or even making it up to sound tough. But others remembered that Vincent had seemed genuinely shaken when he told these stories, as if he was confessing something that weighed on him. The investigators laid out the most probable scenario based on the evidence they had. On the night of the 8th of November 2016, Michael Durant was patrolling the Northern Trail System, investigating reports of illegal camping and trapping. He discovered evidence of Vincent Howell's activities, the campfire, the illegal snare traps. He radioed his findings at 10:23 p.m. and stated his intention to investigate further. At some point between then and 10:41 p.m., Michael encountered Vincent on the trail. Vincent, likely intoxicated or high on drugs, possibly armed with knives or tools used for trapping, appeared threatening. The trail camera captured Michael's reaction, stopping, assessing the threat, reaching for his weapon but not drawing it, and then making the decision to retreat rather than confront Vincent alone in the dark. Michael began moving back down the trail, intending to return to his vehicle and call for backup. Vincent, either following Michael or simply continuing in the same direction, appeared on camera 3 minutes later, moving with the awkward gait that could be explained by intoxication or impairment. What happened next was the part that would never be fully known. Did Vincent pursue Michael? Did he threaten him, forcing Michael to leave the trail and try to evade him through the forest? Or did Michael simply misjudge his position in the dark, stepping over the edge of the ravine while trying to find his way back to his vehicle? The injuries suggested a fall, but whether that fall was purely accidental or whether Vincent's presence and threatening behavior had directly contributed to it was impossible to prove. If Vincent had chased Michael, if he'd forced him off the trail into unfamiliar terrain, then Vincent bore responsibility for creating the circumstances that led to Michael's death, even if he hadn't physically pushed him. But Vincent was dead, and no amount of investigation could compel him to answer for what he'd done or failed to do that night. The case was officially closed on November 15, 2023. The county sheriff held a press conference to announce the findings. Michael Durant's death was ruled accidental, with contributing factors of suspicious circumstances. The official conclusion was that Michael had died from injuries sustained in a fall while on duty, and that the fall occurred during an encounter with an individual believed to be Vincent Howell, who was engaged in illegal activity at the time. It was the closest thing to justice the case would ever see, and it was unsatisfying in the way that real-world conclusions often are messy, incomplete, and lacking the clean resolution that everyone wanted. Sarah Durant was notified before the press conference. She traveled from Portland back to the town near Cascade Ridge that she'd left 5 years earlier, bringing her daughters with her. The girls were teenagers now, 13 and 15 years old, old enough to understand what had happened to their father, and old enough to grieve him as someone they'd actually known, rather than as an abstract loss. The discovery of Michael's remains brought a kind of closure, but it was closure edged with pain. They finally knew what had happened. They could stop imagining scenarios where Michael was alive somewhere, suffering or imprisoned or amnesiac. They knew he'd died 7 years ago, probably within hours of when he'd vanished, that he'd been injured and alone at the bottom of a ravine with no way to call for help, that he might have been conscious long enough to understand what was happening to him, but too injured to save himself. It was the truth, but the truth was excruciating. The community of Cascade Ridge held a memorial service on November 19, 2023. It was held at the park headquarters, in a clearing overlooking the mountains that Michael had spent 9 years protecting. Over 200 people attended, rangers from Cascade Ridge and other parks across Washington, former colleagues, friends, community members who'd searched for Michael in 2016 and who'd never forgotten him. Sarah and her daughters stood at the front, flanked by Michael's parents who were now in their 80s and frail from age and grief. A chaplain spoke about service and sacrifice. Tom Hendricks, Michael's former supervisor who'd retired in 2019, gave a eulogy that was equal parts tribute and apology tribute to the ranger Michael had been, apology for not finding him sooner, for not protecting him better. Michael's ashes, what remained after 7 years of exposure had been cremated, were interred in a cemetery in Riverside, the town where he and Sarah had lived. His headstone was simple: Michael Durant, 1980, 2-2016, park ranger, husband, father. Gone but never forgotten. The trail camera footage that had finally broken the case open remained a source of complicated emotions for everyone connected to it. On one hand, it had provided the crucial evidence that led searchers to Michael's remains and allowed his family to finally have answers. On the other hand, it was a recording of a man's final minutes of safety, a document of the moment when everything went wrong. Park staff who'd seen the footage found it disturbing watching Michael react to danger, knowing that less than an hour later he would be dead, unable to reach back through time and warn him or help him. The footage was kept as evidence in the investigation files, but the decision was made not to release it publicly. The family didn't need the world to see Michael's final moments, didn't need his death turned into entertainment for true crime enthusiasts who would analyze every frame looking for details to speculate about. Cascade Ridge State Park implemented changes in the wake of Michael Durant's death. New safety protocols were established for solo patrols. Rangers were now required to check in by radio every 15 minutes when working alone at night, and patrol routes were adjusted to keep rangers closer to areas with cell phone coverage and backup access. The park installed additional cameras and improved the system for reviewing footage regularly rather than letting it accumulate unexamined. At the park headquarters, a bronze plaque was mounted near the entrance, honoring Michael Durant's service and reminding everyone who worked there of the dangers that came with protecting wilderness areas. But even with the case closed and the remains found and the new protocols in place, there remained a gap in the story that would never be filled. The minutes between 10:41 p.m., when the camera captured Michael retreating, and whenever he fell into the ravine, were lost to darkness and death. What exactly happened in that span of time? Whether Vincent Howell chased Michael, whether words were exchanged, whether Michael saw the ravine before he fell, or whether it took him by complete surprise would never be known. The forest had witnessed it, but the forest kept its secrets. The trail camera that had captured the crucial footage remained mounted on its tree along the Blackwater Creek Trail, still recording, still documenting the endless parade of hikers and wildlife that moved through Cascade Ridge. It stood as an accidental monument to the case, a piece of technology that had done what human searchers couldn't preserve, a moment in time that eventually revealed the truth. Rangers who patrolled that section of trail would sometimes stop and look up at the camera, thinking about what it had recorded, about the ranger who died not far from where they stood. The forest was beautiful. Everyone agreed on that. The mountains and the trees and the rivers were worth protecting, worth dedicating a career to preserving. But the forest was also indifferent to human life, neither malevolent nor benevolent, just vast and wild and capable of swallowing people who made a single wrong step. Michael Durant had loved this place and had died in it, and the trail camera stood, watch over it all, recording everything and understanding nothing.